We're joined today by Jim Lee. He's president and CEO of Susquehanna Polling and Research. We're just about to share results from the latest Susquehanna Polling and Research data. It's notable to mention that this poll was conducted July 22nd through the 28th. That begins the day after President Joe Biden announced his withdrawal from the election. Did you approach this poll with any certain expectations?
We honestly didn't know what we were going to find here. The electorate has been so fluid right now, but a lot of the polling with Biden and Trump, Francine, showed a very close race in the key battleground states. But with Kamala Harris in the race, we weren't really sure what we were going to find.
So one of the first questions starts off looking at the likelihood of voting in the general election. 93% said that was excellent. 7% said good. How does this compare to previous recent polls in terms of voter likelihood to vote?
It shows that voter enthusiasm is actually up in comparison to past elections, Francine. That question seeks to really lay the foundation for the poll because we want to sample people that say they have an excellent or good chance of voting. If our callers were told they only had a fair or poor chance of voting, they were disqualified from the poll. What that means is that we have a lot of confidence in this poll because we can say it was done with likely voters. These are people that told our telephone agents they have a super good chance of voting in November. So we know the poll is conducted scientifically with likely voters, and that gives us a high degree of confidence to be able to share the numbers with your audience.
The next question starts to look at issues of interest. The original question had a slew of issues. We just have the top responded answers on our graphic. Which two issues most influence your vote? And the top categories included inflation and the economy, receiving 38%, illegal immigration at 28%, protecting democracy at 27%, abortion access at 22%, and crime and public safety at 22%. Can you talk a little bit about how this compares to previous polls and perhaps whether or not the issues of importance or priority have fluctuated over the last year or so?
Yeah, usually what we find in polling, Francine, particularly with national elections, like an election for president, is that voters care about the economy. That's usually the top issue. Usually most elections are pocketbook issues. Now, these inflation voters, people that say inflation and the economy are the number one issue facing their household, that favors the Trump voters because among those people that say inflation is number one, they're actually breaking for Trump by a 50 to 38 margin. So the Kamala Harris campaign is in a difficult position because they don't want the election to be a referendum on inflation because they're the incumbent party. They presided over the economy for the last 4 years. And it behooves them to make the election about abortion access and protecting democracy and healthcare, which are really three signature issues that the Democratic Party platform likes to talk about. Now, what's new about this survey in comparison to prior surveys is that illegal immigration is the number two hot issue among voters in this poll. That is completely new. We don't usually see that, but there's been so much media attention about our southern border and the hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants that have crossed the southern border. It's now top of mind to many voters. Those illegal immigration voters are voting 2-1 for Trump. So that's an issue that really favors the Trump campaign.
Let's next read the next question. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, how excited and enthusiastic are you about the upcoming presidential election? 50% rated it as 10%, 11% rated their enthusiasm at 5%, and 10% rated their enthusiasm as an 8. So do you think the announcement both of President Biden's withdrawal from the race as well as perhaps the assassination attempt against Donald Trump the week prior, do you think that both of those played into the level of enthusiasm over going to the polls?
So here's the important takeaway from this question. Because it's a scale of 1 to 10, we asked voters to rank on that scale how enthusiastic they were by giving us a number between 1 and 10. Obviously, a score closer to 10 means they're much more enthusiastic. A score closer to 0 means they're not enthusiastic. What's important to look at here is the mean score. The mean score for Republicans on this question was a 7.78 out of 10. That's the mean score for Republicans. For Democrats, the mean score was a 7.67, only a fraction of a hairline below the mean score for Republicans. What does that mean to your audience? It means Democrats are now just as enthusiastic about voting as Republicans. And as you said earlier, this poll was conducted immediately after Joe Biden handed the baton to Kamala Harris. So what we're seeing in this poll, and this is a fascinating question, the enthusiasm level for both parties is almost equal. Why is that important? Pennsylvania is a very close state in voter registration. The Democrats have a voter registration advantage now by only a couple percentage points. So if Republican voters are more enthusiastic than Democrats or vice versa, that helps their party on election day. That really suggests this will be a very close election because the enthusiasm level is super high with both political parties. And that wasn't always the case. Prior to Kamala Harris being in the race, Republicans had enthusiasm and Democrats were very disaffected. Democrats were just very vanilla on Joe Biden's presidency. The president's approval ratings were in the low 40s. People just weren't excited about Joe Biden as a candidate. But now that's all changed. We are in a completely new ballgame now. And this question really shows that Democrats are just as enthusiastic as Republicans. And that is a big deal in a state where voter registration is so closely tied between the political parties.
Let's take a look now at the presidential race. Kamala Harris is coming in at 47%, Donald Trump at 43%, Not Sure measuring 7%, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at 3%. Can you tell whether this is the influence of perhaps a honeymoon period for Kamala Harris being the timing of this particular poll, or do you think that this is how voters are actually aligning at this time and perhaps moving forward?
I think it's actually how voters are aligning. There's actually good news for both Trump and Harris in this poll. Starting with Harris first, when I looked at the internals in the poll, she's getting 86% of the Democratic vote already. Keep in mind, this poll started only hours after Biden handed the baton to Kamala Harris. She's already solidified the Democratic base. And remember what I said earlier, Democrat voters are just as enthusiastic as Republicans. So the fact that she has a solidified base of support among the base Democratic Party speaks well for her. That is a huge talking point that she can say, I've already secured the base of the Democratic Party because she's already getting 86%. The good news for Trump in this poll is that the difference between 47 and 43% is a 4-point difference. That whole statistical margin of error, the margin of error for this survey was plus or minus 4 percentage points. Not to get too wonky on your audience, but that means the results could be off by up to 4 points. Well, that's the difference between Harris and Trump. It's a 4-point difference. That means the race is technically a statistical tie. That's the good news for the Trump campaign. The bad news for the Trump campaign in this poll, he's getting 85% of the Republican vote. That might sound like a lot, but because Democrats still outnumber Republicans in registration, Donald Trump needs 95% of the Republican vote if he's going to win a purple state like Pennsylvania. Because he can't just win with Republicans in a state like PA. He needs what we call independent voters to vote for him. They're currently leaning towards Kamala Harris right now. He needs what we call swing voters to vote for him. Swing voters are people in our polls that tell us They don't vote straight Republican or straight Democrat. They mix and match their ticket on a regular basis. That's a very vital cohort of the Pennsylvania electorate. I affectionately call them swing voters because their vote swings back and forth between the political parties. They're actually leaning towards Kamala Harris right now by a slight 47-41 margin. So Donald Trump has some ground to make up. But all in all, a 4-point difference shows this race is really still up for grabs between both parties. And one other factor to mention here, if I can spend an additional couple seconds, I track national polling that's being done in Pennsylvania. There's a website called 538, which aggregates all the polling that's being released in Pennsylvania. Right now, the average of all the polling that's been released in Pennsylvania since Harris got in the race shows that she has a 0.5% lead in Pennsylvania, a half a percentage point lead. You can't get much closer than that. That's the national average of all the Pennsylvania polling. And as our poll shows here today, since the 4-point margin is still within the poll's margin of error, this race is really up for grabs. And both the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign can probably feel emboldened by these numbers.
Now, a moment ago, we talked about the increase in enthusiasm among both parties. Do you think that third party or independent candidates such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. still pose a threat as a spoiler in this race?
The irony of it is he doesn't pose as much of a threat as a spoiler because in the current survey, 3% of Democrats are voting for Kennedy and 3% of Republicans are voting for Kennedy. It looks like he's hurting them equally the same, which means it's a non-issue. It would be one thing if we saw that, a bigger percentage of voters from one party or the other were voting for Robert F. Kennedy. He would be then suppressing the vote for one of the two major party candidates. But he's drawing equally from Trump and Harris right now. It really looks like his numbers have teetered out because in earlier polling this year, Kennedy was getting anywhere between 10 and 20% of the national vote in some polls. But I think as we get closer to Election Day, the support for third-party candidates tends to dry up because people don't want to throw their vote away. And they don't think he has a realistic chance of winning.
Let's take a look at the U.S. Senate race now. Bob Casey, the incumbent, is coming in at 47% on this poll. Dave McCormick, the Republican, at 42%. 10% are saying they are not sure. Do we know who are the undecideds at this point?
Undecided voters are split equally between the parties right now. There are just as many Republican undecideds as there are Democratic undecideds. The Casey campaign probably feels a little bit better about these numbers than the McCormick campaign. Obviously, they're leading by 5 points. That's a little bit outside the poll's margin of error. Casey is getting 85% of the Democratic vote right now, and he's actually pulling 7% of Republicans over to his corner. What makes this poll, I think, important for the Casey campaign is he's winning independents, which are the fastest growing political party in the state right now. It's not registered Republicans or Democrats, but registered independents are actually outperforming Republicans and Democrats in new registrations. He's winning independent voters by a 55-35 margin. And that's important because in a state like Pennsylvania, the straight Republican vote, the straight Democrat vote, that doesn't get you to 51% in a purple state like ours. You need the support of these independents. Now, the good news for McCormick in this poll, even though he's losing by 5 points, Francine, they have to feel somewhat pleased with these results as well. And the reason is because Casey isn't over 50%. Why is that important? The national polling right now shows that most Americans are unhappy with the direction of the country. we know that people that are unhappy with the direction of the country tend to vote for the challenger, not the incumbent. So those undecided voters are probably lower hanging fruit for the McCormick campaign, because Casey's not over 50% yet. It's easier to make the case to these undecided voters that if you like the status quo, you should vote for Bob Casey. But if you want change, if you want a new direction for America, then the McCormick campaign is the campaign you should vote for. And as I said earlier, most Americans are dissatisfied with the direction of the country. So they seem to be more approachable to the McCormick campaign. And with Casey under 50% in a two-way race, you can't count the McCormick campaign out by any stretch of the imagination. They're still in this race.
The next question reads, would you vote for the Republican or Democratic candidate for state legislature? Democrat receives 46% of those polled, Republican 44%, not sure 9%. Do you think that President Biden's withdrawal from the race has had an impact on down ticket races?
That's an excellent question. This question really seeks to measure the loyalty that voters have to their political party in those down ballot races. And what's fascinating about this result is it almost matches the registration of Pennsylvania right to the point. When you looked earlier at the demographics of our poll, 46% of our interviews, or maybe it was 45%, were with registered Democrats. 44% were with registered Republicans. Look how closely the numbers are in this particular question. Why is that important to your audience? The Pennsylvania House of Representatives right now leans Democrat by only one seat. A one-seat swing can make all the difference in the world and would tip control to the House of Representatives. This result shows how closely competitive these legislative districts will be. And what that means is that on election day, when the numbers start rolling in, Francine, for these state house districts, don't expect to see one party or the other win a landslide. You're looking at a House of Representatives that's going to go Democrat or Republican by just a couple seats. We're looking at divided government potentially again for the next session of the General Assembly. And that's what's so fascinating about this, because it looks like voters want divided government, because 44% say they're voting Republican for the legislature, 46% say they're voting Democrat. That's a real toss-up. So when you're looking at the numbers on election day, I think you're going to see these state House and Senate races are going to be very close. And whoever wins the House and Senate, it's only going to be by a couple seats.
The next question looks at job approval rating for Governor Josh Shapiro. 55% approve, 26% disapprove, and 18% are not sure. What do you derive from this?
Well, very simply, Josh Shapiro has a fair amount of popularity. He's well-liked by a majority of voters in the state. And keep in mind, only 45% of our interviews were with registered Democrats in the Shapiro party. But 55%, a higher 55%, say they approve of the job he's doing. That's a good place for Josh Shapiro to be. He's got an approval rating above 50%. And when I went back and looked at his approval rating and I compare it to his predecessors, Tom Wolf and Ed Rendell, after the same amount of time in office, Shapiro is overperforming his predecessors in approval ratings after a year and a half in office. That's a good place for the governor to be. That means he's got the bully pulpit. People like him. They generally like the job he's doing. And that's why you've seen such intense media attention focused on whether or not Josh Shapiro will be the running mate for Kamala Harris, which I think we'll know the answer to in just several days.
Final question we'll look at, would you vote for an ally of Governor Josh Shapiro or a candidate who will be a check and balance on the governor? 49% would vote for an ally of Governor Shapiro, 37% a check and balance on the governor, and 13% are not sure. Talk a little bit about what you derive from this.
What I derive from this is we do some polling for Republican candidates running for the legislature. And we do polling for Democratic groups that are running campaigns for the legislature as well. What I tell my Republican clients is, if you're a Republican member of the House or a Republican member of the Senate, you need to be acutely aware of the fact that Shapiro has a good approval rating, and most voters say they want a legislator who will actually work with the governor. So it's important that Republicans, and I tell this to Republican clients, they need to not be perceived. They can't afford to be perceived as a hardliner against the Shapiro policies. They have to be perceived as someone who will be willing to work with the governor when it's in the best interest to do so. It doesn't mean they can't oppose him on certain pieces of legislation, but they have to be very careful about when they publicly oppose the governor, because voters are saying, look, we want someone in the legislature who's going to be an advocate for the governor's policies. We want to see his agenda advance. We don't want a check and balance. And that means unless you come from a bright red district, you have to be very careful about these numbers, because it means legislators have to show their constituents they're willing to work with the governor of the other party when it suits the district. And that's the important takeaway here, particularly for Republican lawmakers. They can't afford to be painted as obstacles to the governor's agenda, because these numbers suggest many voters are looking for someone to help advance the Shapiro agenda forward.
What will you look at as you continue to conduct polls leading to the November election?
We'll continue to look and see where these undecided voters are going. 10% of voters are undecided in the Senate race between Casey and McCormick. 7% of voters are undecided in the presidential race between Trump and Kamala Harris. We'll be looking to see if the races continue to stay tight, or if one party or the other seems to start picking up these undecided voters. They will make the difference in the outcome of the election. So that's the first thing I'll be looking at. The second thing I'll be looking at is if there will be any bounce after Kamala Harris picks her running mate. If she picks Josh Shapiro, our Pennsylvania governor, to be on the ticket with her, knowing that in this poll, Shapiro has a 55% approval rating. This could be one of the first times in history, Francine, that a vice presidential pick actually helped solidify a state. I mean, Pennsylvania is the paramount battleground state right now for the presidential candidates. As I said earlier, Harris leads the state based on all the polling by only a 0.5 percentage point. Picking someone like Josh Shapiro, who's popular in our state, as our polling shows, could help give her an extra point or two in this election. And that could mean all the difference between a Harris win and a Harris defeat come November 5th. So those will be the two things I'll be tracking. Our next poll will come after she makes her selection as vice president. So we should be able to pick up any movement we see based on who she picked to be her running mate.
Jim Lee is president and CEO of Susquehanna Polling and Research. Thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Francine.